Hello and good evening, everyone. I'm Kevin Lavelle. I'm the board president of Pittsburgh Arts and Lectures, and on behalf of Pittsburgh Arts and Lectures and our Made Local program partner, the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh, I welcome you all to this evening's lecture. Thank you for joining us for this Made Local series to celebrate the Pittsburgh launch of Embodied Injustice, Race, Disability, and Health by Mary Crossley. Tonight's program is being live streamed and, with Mary's permission, will be available for viewing on our YouTube channel. Thank you to our event co-sponsor and co-presenter, the FISA Foundation, our event sponsor, the David C. Frederick Honors College, and our promotional sponsor, Pitt Law. And our good friends from White Whale Bookstore, before and after the lecture, are here with signed copies of Embodied Injustice, and Mary will personalize your books after the program here on this corner of the stage where the signing line will start. Introducing Mary Crossley is Christy Troutman, Executive Director of the FISA Foundation, which champions equity, justice, safety, and inclusion for women, girls, and people with disabilities, combating systemic racism that impedes progress for these populations in southwestern Pennsylvania. Please give a warm welcome to the Executive Director of FISA, Christy Troutman.
Good evening. As Kevin said, my name is Christy Troutman. I'm a short white woman. I have short, rapidly graying hair, and I'm wearing my reading glasses tonight. I have a tan cardigan, black slacks, and a flowered shirt. We usually start with visual descriptions as an access point for people who can't see or don't have access to visual in the moment. So I am Executive Director of FISA Foundation, and we have been working on addressing access to health care and dental care for disabled people for 20 years. In that capacity, I've become a fan and a follower of Mary Crossley's work exposing the profound barriers that prevent disabled people, particularly disabled people of color, from receiving good, respectful, patient-centered health care. It is such an honor to introduce her to you tonight. Mary Crossley is the author of the 2022 book, Embodied Injustice, Race, Disability, and Health, the latest publication in a long career of scholarship in disability and health law. Professor Crossley is a John E. Murray Faculty Scholar and Director of the Health Law Program at Pitt Law. She has written broadly on issues of inequality in healthcare financing and delivery, and has published articles in numerous esteemed law journals, including those associated with Columbia, Notre Dame, Yale, and the Michigan Journal of Race and Law. In addition to extensive scholarly publications, Mary developed a seminar on health justice and has taught courses in health law and policy, bioethics and law, healthcare compliance, family law, and torts. She is an elected member of the American Law Institute and an appointed member of the Pennsylvania State Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. She serves as a member of the board of Access Lex Institute and for the American Occupational Therapy Association. Crossley served as dean at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law from 2005 to 2012, focusing her leadership on initiatives related to curricular reform, innovation programming, and promoting diversity. In 2013, she was selected as a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Public Health Law Scholar in Residence. And the following year, she served as faculty mentor for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's Future of Public Health Law Education Faculty Fellowship Program. Immediately prior to coming to Pitt Law in 2005, Crossley was the Florida Bar Health Law Selection Professor at Florida State University, and before that she was on faculty at the University of California, Hastings College of Law, including 2 years of service as Associate Academic Dean. Before beginning to teach, she practiced corporate and health law in San Francisco and New Haven and clerked for Judge Harry Welford on the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. I present to you my esteemed friend and colleague, Mary Crossley. Mary.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Mary Crossley, and I'm really delighted to be here this evening. I am a white woman with graying brown hair, eyeglasses, and wearing a flowered shirt. I want to thank Pittsburgh Arts and Lectures for the opportunity to talk about my book this evening, and to thank Christy Troutman not only for that generous introduction, but also for her enthusiastic support of this book over the past few years. And I want to thank all of you who braved the Pittsburgh winter evening to come out to the hall tonight, as well as to thank those of you who are joining us online. I know that none of us really feels like logging into yet another Zoom-like meeting. It's kind of odd to think that when I started writing this book, I didn't even know what Zoom was. I started writing in January 2020 as COVID-19 was first reaching the US. Because I was on sabbatical, I spent every day immersed in research and writing. As I researched and wrote, COVID-19 erupted around the globe and reinforced in the most terrible ways the relevance of my project. So many stories from the pandemic illustrated the concerns I was writing about. Some of those stories are difficult to hear. I'll start tonight by telling you just one of them. That's the story of Michael Hickson, who died on June 11, 2020, from complications of COVID-19. Michael Hickson was a 46-year-old Black man, the father of 5. He had had a career as an auto insurance claims estimator until it was cut short when he suffered sudden cardiac arrest at just the age of 43 years old. Complications left him with quadriplegia, blindness, and brain injuries. Although he had difficulty speaking and remembering things, Michael Hickson continued to participate in his family's life, joking with his children and talking with his wife about their lives. He contracted COVID-19 in a nursing home and was transferred to a hospital in Austin, Texas. As with many people hospitalized with COVID-19, the course of Michael Hickson's illness was difficult. He developed pneumonia, a urinary tract infection, and sepsis. After he'd been in the hospital for just 3 days, his medical team communicated with his family that, in the physician's opinion, continuing to treat Michael would be futile, that further treatment offered no chance of improvement, and that he should begin receiving hospice care. His sister, a physician living in Washington, D.C., agreed with the medical team's proposed shift in approach. But Melissa Hickson, Michael's wife of 18 years, rejected the suggestion that it was time to throw in the towel on her husband's life. She agreed that he should not be intubated, but believed that he had a chance to live if less invasive treatment for COVID-19 was continued. In a conversation recorded by Mrs. Hickson, she asks her husband's doctor why continuing to treat his COVID-19 would be futile. The doctor responded, quote, "'Cause as of right now, his quality of life, he doesn't have much of one." Mrs. Hickson asked, "What do you mean? Because he's paralyzed with a brain injury, he doesn't have quality of life?" The doctor replied, "Correct." Over his wife's objections, the hospital withdrew treatment from Michael Hickson and put him in hospice care. After 6 days, without any treatment for COVID-19, he died. Multiple news outlets told the story of the hospital's withdrawal of treatment from Michael Hickson and his demise. But those accounts did not, and probably could not, offer a fully fleshed out description of the fullness of Michael Hickson's life, of his relationship with his wife, children, and friends. The accounts also did not, and could not, answer the questions that Michael Hickson's life and his story left me wondering about. Would Michael Hickson have survived COVID-19 and gone home to his family if the hospital had treated his illness aggressively rather than withdrawing treatment? Would he have died even with continued treatment? Would the hospital have insisted on withdrawing treatment if Michael Hickson had not had cognitive and physical disabilities? Would it have insisted on withdrawing treatment over his wife's objections if Michael Hickson had been a white man. So back to writing my book. It may not be obvious why a woman who identifies as white and non-disabled would write a book about race, disability, and health injustice. I cannot speak with the authority of lived experience on these matters, but I've tried to be a student of those who can, as well as of the scholars who have done important work in these fields. My book was published in August of last year, but the idea of looking broadly at race-based and disability-based health inequities and their connection has been in my mind for a long time. I became a law professor the year after the Americans with Disabilities Act was enacted, and most of my earlier research explored how disability discrimination law might apply in various healthcare and health policy settings. While I was doing this work, I increasingly learned how disability inequities are just one strand in a much larger fabric of disparities and inequities experienced by Black and Brown communities and other groups that our society has marginalized. And as I studied the health-related injustices experienced by Black people in particular, I discerned what seemed to be parallels or similarities to the health-related inequities experienced by disabled people. A core similarity was that at the root of both were deeply ingrained and erroneous assumptions about bodily difference and inferiority. So that's what my title, Embodied Injustice, tries to express. That health-related injustices endured by Black and disabled people flow in part from unfounded beliefs that there is something about the bodies and minds of disabled people and Black people that is intrinsically different and somehow inferior as compared to the white, abled bodies that the medical profession, the healthcare system, and society more broadly have established as norms. As I studied more, I realized that it's also critically important to consider how the experiences and identities of being Black and being disabled intersect in the lives of people who are both Black and disabled. What I do in the book is to describe several different areas where I found similarities between the health-related inequities experienced by Black people and disabled people. From there, I go on to consider the importance of paying attention to how Blackness and disability coincide or intersect in many people's lives. My goal was to help strengthen the foundation for collaborative advocacy addressing health disparities based on race and disability. So this evening, I'm going to share with you one similarity that the book examines, talk a little bit about the concepts of racism and ableism, and then talk about the importance of considering Blackness and disability intersectionally. A widely shared mistrust of the medical profession and healthcare system is the parallel that I'm going to talk about. This is a big topic, but I can give you some highlights this evening. The starting point is that trust matters to medical outcomes. Distrust of the medical system can affect a person's decisions concerning whether to seek medical care, how openly to share concerns, and how closely to follow a provider's advice. The recognition that low levels of trust can thus contribute to poor outcomes have led to various initiatives over the past years to increase the trust that Black people or those from other marginalized communities have in medicine. These initiatives approached patients' low trust levels almost as if they were a vitamin deficiency that needed to be corrected. Recently, though, the conversation around medical trust has begun to shift. Conversations today are more likely to identify the problem as a dearth of trustworthiness on the part of the medical and scientific communities, and to consider what remedial steps might make those communities demonstrably more trustworthy. The sources of medical distrust among Black people and disabled people are complex and have many dimensions. This evening, I'll highlight a shared history of being subjected to non-consensual medical experimentation and current day experiences of disregard and devaluation within healthcare. Medical Apartheid is the title Harriet Washington gave her sweeping history of medical experimentation on Black people in America. The book reveals long-standing and pervasive willingness among scientists, doctors, and the government to exploit Black bodies as to further white goals that included a tangled mix of medical knowledge, power, and profit. Washington describes the well-known Tuskegee study, which ran from 1932 to 1972 and was sponsored by the U.S. Public Health Service, among other institutions. This decades-long study examined untreated syphilis in Black men, withholding penicillin from men, some of whom are pictured on the slide, even after that effective treatment became available. But Washington argues that the Tuskegee study should be understood as emblematic, not as an isolated occurrence. The historical record also includes surgical experiments that J. Marion Sims, whom some call the father of modern gynecology, performed on numerous enslaved women in the 1850s. So this is a statue of Sims that long stood in Central Park. The goal of the surgeries was to figure out how to repair vesicovaginal fistulas. Those are injuries that result from childbirth and produce uncontrollable incontinence. Sims developed his surgical technique through trial and error, operating at least 30 times on one woman named Anarcha alone. Ether was not yet in common usage, so the women received no anesthesia during these repeated experimental surgeries. Recent debates about the ethics of Sims surgeries have a kind of Rorschach test quality to them. Apologists portray Sims as a product of his time and laud how knowledge that he developed ultimately helped women with the condition. Critics denounce Sims for personally profiting from the pain he caused enslaved women who were entirely unable to withhold their consent or seek medical care. And this is a picture of protesters at the statue of Sims in Central Park. And those protests eventually led to the removal of his statue from Central Park. However you look at it, Sims' career exemplifies a broader pattern of white men, and doctors in particular, assuming control over Black women's bodies for their own purposes. So I'd like to close this story by sharing a photo of a monument to the enslaved women on whom Sims experimented. It was erected in Montgomery, Alabama in 2020 and is named the Mothers of Gynecology. Black people have also long undergone more mundane devaluation and discrimination in medical settings. Decades after the civil rights laws ended legal segregation in healthcare facilities, many Black Americans still receive healthcare in facilities that continue to be de facto segregated. Black people today regularly experience that they are treated differently from white people by healthcare professionals. In a 2020 survey, 7 in 10 Black Americans said that the healthcare system treats patients unfairly based on their race or ethnicity, either very or somewhat often. 1 in 5 Black adults reported experiencing racial discrimination when getting health care for themselves or a family member just in the past year. In short, contemporary experience layers on to histories of exploitation and devaluation to give Black Americans good reason to be suspicious of doctors in the healthcare system. Research documenting that better health outcomes result when Black patients are treated by Black doctors gives credence to such suspicions. A stunning example can be seen in a 2020 study finding that the mortality rate for Black babies was cut in half when Black doctors cared for those infants. And that's an effect that showed up even more strongly in complicated cases. Like Black people, people with disabilities have a history of being subjected involuntarily to medical research. In many cases, the research occurred in state-run institutions where disabled people had no power to refuse to participate and where degradation and mistreatment of residents were endemic. The 1972 expose of horrific conditions at Willowbrook State School for children with intellectual disabilities is probably the best known example. Beyond its squalor, though, Willowbrook was also the site of experiments that Dr. Saul Krugman performed on disabled children. In the name of searching for a vaccine or a cure for hepatitis, Krugman extracted hepatitis virus from the feces of 6 infected Willowbrook residents and used it to infect other children living at Willowbrook by putting the virus in their food. Krugman, like Sims, has his defenders. Some scholars defended Krugman because he obtained consent from parents of the child subjects, as well as independent review from other experts. And his research, in fact, contributed to the development of a vaccine for hepatitis B. Other ethicists, however, argue that no amount of knowledge gained can justify intentionally infecting disabled children with a potentially deadly virus. One critic wrote to the medical journal The Lancet, quote, "If Krugman and his colleagues are keen to continue their experiments, I suggest that they invite the parents of the children involved to participate." I wonder what the response would be. Like Black people, disabled people also experience discrimination and disregard in more mundane medical interactions. Seeking medical care routinely entails barriers and indignities for people with disabilities. Decades after the ADA's passage, the medical equipment in many providers' offices remains inaccessible. Research published in 2018 reported that among 250 specialist physicians who were asked to accept the referral of a hypothetical patient who had partial paralysis and used a wheelchair, fewer than 10% of the physicians had appropriate equipment or personnel trained to help examine patients with disabilities. This lack of accessible equipment and appropriate training keeps patients who use a wheelchair from being weighed, from being properly examined, or receiving screening tests like pap smears or mammograms. Moreover, disabled people may find that they aren't treated respectfully as autonomous agents. They describe how physicians regularly undervalue medical interventions that support their daily functioning, but that don't fix their disability. Disabled people also describe how doctors still express views of disability as a flaw that needs to be corrected by doctors. Research going back decades documents that many physicians tend to believe that disability causes diminished enjoyment of or satisfaction with life, when in fact, surveys of people with varying disabilities show them to be about as satisfied with their lives as non-disabled people. Confirming the persistence of these erroneous assumptions, 82% of physicians who responded to a recent national survey indicated that they believe that people with significant disability generally have a worse quality of life than non-disabled people. Bill Peace's story offers a chilling illustration of how physicians may fail to appreciate the value of continued life to a disabled person. An anthropologist and disability rights activist who used a wheelchair, Peace wrote about an encounter he had when hospitalized with a life-threatening wound infection. Peace was medically stable but was vomiting and had a high fever when a physician he had never met visited him at 2 a.m. Alone with Peace in the hospital room, the physician detailed the medical, social, and financial challenges of continuing to treat Peace's wound. Then the physician told Peace he could discontinue the antibiotic treatment needed to save Peace's life and assured him that if Peace chose that option, he could be made very comfortable. Peace rejected the suggestion. Later, after recovering from his wound, he described that night, writing, "My fear was based on the knowledge that my existence as a person with a disability was not valued. Many people, the physician I met on that fateful night included, assumed disability is a fate worse than death. In a visceral and potentially lethal way, that night made me realize that I was not a human being, but rather a tragic figure. Out of the kindness of the physician's heart, I was being given a chance to end my life." Peace insists that his suspicion and fear were not unique. He wrote, "Most people with a disability fear even the most routine hospitalization. We do not fear any of the commonplace indignities that those without a disability worry about when hospitalized. Our fear is primal. That will our lives be considered devoid of value?" So we can see historical, empirical, and experiential evidence of medicine's exploitation and devaluation of Black people and people with disabilities in the United States. The stories portrayed are not identical, to be sure. They have a similar effect, though, of indicating that Black people's and disabled people's shared wariness of medical practitioners and researchers is a sensible response to unspoken and explicit messages conveyed over decades and centuries. The stories that I've been telling you so far largely involve interpersonal interactions, where health professionals have biased views of Black people or disabled people, either consciously or unconsciously. Biased actions at the interpersonal level can produce very real health harms. But the health-related harms caused by structural racism or ableism are even greater. So let me tell you what I mean when I talk about racism and ableism. In basic terms, we can define racism as the assignment of people of color to inferior status and treatment based on unfounded beliefs about their innate inferiority, along with the unjust treatment of people of color, whether it's intended or not. Ableism, a term that is less widely recognized, can be defined as by substituting the phrase disabled people for people of color in the definition that I just gave you. So the definition would be that ableism is the assignment of disabled people to inferior status and treatment based on unfounded beliefs about their innate inferiority, along with intentional or unintentional unjust treatment of them. I realize that for some folks, bringing up racism can be a conversation stopper or can provoke feelings of defensiveness. And I think that's because of a mismatch in understandings of what the term encompasses. Certainly, one form of racism is the hateful or malicious or overtly biased attitudes that some people exhibit towards Black people or other people of color. But it can also include unconscious race-based biases that people may not even be conscious that they have. These implicit biases, which we might think of as being akin to ingrained assumptions or stereotypes, they develop when a person is exposed repeatedly to images and descriptions in media or social interactions. Both overt racial malice and implicit bias are forms of interpersonal racism. The other category of racism that is actually more important than interpersonal racism in causing health disparities is what is often called structural racism or systemic racism or institutional racism. And those terms have distinct meanings for folks who study this area closely, but for our purposes, I'm going to group them together under the label of structural racism. The key idea here is that society's laws, policies, economics, and institutions can be structured in a way that disadvantages people of color. It's not just about people behaving badly or based on implicit biases. It's the way that systems are set up in a way that can hold groups of people back, even if those systems appear to treat people the same regardless of race. Explicit and implicit biases connect to structural racism, though, because people who hold those biases may be less likely to object to or even to recognize examples of structural racism. Researchers have used the metaphor of the racism iceberg to suggest how only a small portion of racism existing in our society is visible above the surface of the water, so to speak. The portion above the waterline would be overtly biased or hateful conduct. The portion below the waterline would be what constitutes most racism in the US today, though. It's more difficult to perceive because it's embedded in structures and policies, or to use the iceberg metaphor, it's below the water surface. Another metaphor may also be helpful. One of my, so law professors actually have favorite phrases from Supreme Court opinions. One of my favorite phrases from any Supreme Court opinion is the phrase, built-in headwinds. Chief Justice Burger used the phrase way back in 1971 to describe how some practices used by employers to decide whom to hire could have the effect of disadvantaging Black applicants, even if the practice made no reference to race. The case was the first to hold that practices that on their face are neutral with respect to race, but that have a disproportionately negative impact on Black people could violate employment discrimination laws. In describing such practices as creating built-in headwinds, Chief Justice Burger was using the phrase metaphorically, of course. But its literal origin came back to my mind over winter break, when I was fortunate to get away to a beach in South Carolina for a brief respite from winter. One day, we rented bikes and decided to ride them on the beach. When we first started riding, I felt like I could ride forever. But then we turned around, and I immediately struggled just to move along slowly. There was a brisk wind that day, a wind that I didn't even notice when it was at my back. But once I started riding into it, once I faced a headwind, it slowed my progress in a way that was obvious to me. Structural racism can be thought of as the various kinds of powerful, built-in headwinds that people of color face in society. People who are trying to make progress against the headwinds of structural racism feel them keenly, but people who don't face them, namely white people, may not perceive them at all. Similarly, structural ableism can be thought of as the various kinds of built-in headwinds that disabled people face in society. So, moving away from metaphors, what are some concrete examples? One historical example of structural racism is Southern states' use, prior to the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, of literacy tests to prevent Black people from voting. A current-day example of structural ableism in healthcare is the prevalence of medical office equipment that's not accessible to people who use wheelchairs, as I just talked about. A contemporary example of structural racism in the healthcare realm is the fact that Medicaid, the public health insurance program for low-income Americans, pays doctors notoriously low rates for treating Medicaid enrollees, discouraging many doctors from accepting Medicaid patients. Because Black people, who earn less in the United States than white people, are disproportionately enrolled in Medicaid, the program's low payment rates help create disparities in Black people's ability to access medical care. And instances of structural racism outside of the healthcare sector can disadvantage people of color with respect to social determinants of health, like housing, employment, education, transportation, and the criminal legal system. Disparities in all of those areas have been shown to have significant impacts on health. This idea that structures can be unjust and discriminatory is important to another key point that I make in my book, which involves the intersection of Blackness and disability. Basically, the idea of intersectionality is that to fully appreciate a person's experience, or for the law to ensure that people are not unjustly disadvantaged, it's essential to consider the combined effect of multiple aspects of a person's identity. When legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw first developed the concept back in the late 1980s, she was focused on how Black women experienced workplace discrimination and how those experiences were different from the experiences of Black men or white women, and how that prevented Black women from winning employment discrimination lawsuits. Since then, intersectional analyses have expanded beyond race and gender to encompass other dimensions of people's identity, like sexual orientation or class. But the intersection of Blackness and disability has received remarkably little attention, either empirically by health researchers or in discussions of and advocacy around health justice. Research examining health outcomes and health-related experiences of people who are both Black and disabled has been especially limited. We do know, though, that in the United States, disability is typically more prevalent among Black people than among whites. As this graphic from the CDC shows, approximately 1 in 4 Black people in the United States have a disability, compared to 1 in 5 among white people. Some research also suggests that Black people are more likely to become disabled and to do as they age, and to do so at younger ages. I think that as a society, we really need to pay more attention to the early and disproportionate disablement of Black people. Although the research remains very limited, it seems highly likely that disability's more frequent and earlier appearance among Black people is attributable to unjust social, economic, and political conditions that are the product of structural racism, the built-in headwinds that I was just describing. Scholars coined the term emergent disability to describe how disabling conditions multiply in communities experiencing poverty or disadvantage. Much disability among Black people likely fits within this category of emergent disability. Examples are too easy to identify. The children in Flint, Michigan, who acquired learning disabilities after being exposed to lead in their drinking water. The Black Americans with diabetes, who disproportionately lose limbs to amputation, often because they face barriers to accessing medical care to diagnose and manage their disease. The victims of gun violence living in communities of concentrated poverty, where systematic disinvestment has largely eliminated opportunity, leaving illegal activity to fill the void. Less vivid examples exist as well. One study found that Black women in the US over the age of 50 had a prevalence of physical disability equivalent to white women who were 10 years older. The point I'm trying to make is that for many Black disabled people, more so than for white disabled people, disability has its origin in inequitable social and economic circumstances. And that means that folks who are Black and disabled may face layers of injustice and exclusion. Because of their disability, they may face barriers to full participation in society. But in many cases, having a disability may be chalked up to racial injustices that persist in the US. In those cases, the wins of the disability rights movement aren't enough. Think again about the child in Flint who has been left intellectually disabled by lead poisoning. Good special education services are vitally important to that child, but they're not enough to feel like justice has been satisfied. Or the middle-aged Black man who lost a foot to amputation because he had trouble getting in to see a doctor and his diabetes were not properly managed. Having an accessible medical examination table will be valuable when he gets in to see the doctor again, but it's not enough. When a person's impairment results from unjust social structures, the accommodations and policy adaptations historically sought by the disability rights movement while valuable, are not adequate to redress the injustice experienced. Let me try to wrap up by talking about how I hope the book might contribute to fostering greater solidarity between advocates for racial justice and advocates for disability justice. In the book, I shine a light on similarities in health inequities endured by disabled people and Black people, and underscore the unjustly high prevalence of disability among Black people. In doing so, I aim to contribute kind of metaphorical stones for constructing a foundation for increased cross-movement collective action. In other words, more and stronger partnerships between Black people and disabled people engaging in advocacy and activism for health justice. The book suggests several specific health-related policy targets for collective action where those groups' interests seem to me to be aligned, and I'd be happy to talk about those some in the Q&A if people are interested. But I want to close this evening by suggesting the broader value of paying attention to health justice. While the book focuses on health justice for people who are Black, disabled, or both, the policy objectives that I suggest offer potential benefits for advancing health justice more broadly. Racial justice and disability justice activists are rightly motivated to improve the health prospects and lives of the people they care about most. Pursuing policies to ensure that all members of our society can enjoy good health and long lives will require interventions targeting groups that currently are furthest from that ideal. But most health equity promoting interventions, even if they're targeted to address injustice experienced by a particular group, are readily adaptable to provide broader progress towards equitable and improved health outcomes. One thing we've learned from the successes of the disability rights movement is that many modifications called for by the Americans with Disabilities Act don't benefit only disabled people. The so-called curb cut effect points out how programs or laws designed specifically to benefit a vulnerable group ultimately benefit society more broadly. I expect that many policies or initiatives to increase health equity for Black and disabled people would have a curb cut effect of benefiting the health of many other people as well. And from a purely financial perspective, it's critical to realize that health disparities cost our society huge sums because of lost productivity and the additional costs of addressing medical problems too late. An analysis published in 2018 estimated that eliminating racial health disparities in the US would result in a $135 billion increase to gross domestic product each year. Fundamentally, promoting health justice for Black people, disabled people, and other groups experiencing health disparities does not necessarily entail harming persons in groups that already have been living relatively longer and healthier lives. Health is not a zero-sum game. This is a point that Heather McGee, whom some of you may have seen speak in the Big Hall a few years ago, makes in her best-selling book, The Sum of Us. To be sure, remedying structural inequities and other factors contributing to health disparities will not be costless. It may well require addressing the large and growing inequalities in income and wealth in the United States. Studies find an association across societies between increases in wealth and income inequality and overall worse health outcomes. The flip side of the coin is that more egalitarian societies tend to be healthier overall. We know from the COVID-19 pandemic that poorer, darker-skinned, and disabled people sickened and died at higher rates in the US. But we also know that wealthy, white, and abled people have not been spared. In fact, our cumulative deaths per capita from COVID in the US have been among the highest among large, high-income countries. To me, the message is clear. Our well-being is connected. We should learn from the pandemic that As noted health justice scholar Dana Bowen Matthew puts it, structural inequality threatens the health of our entire population, not just the health of the poor. Or, to adapt an often quoted warning from Dr. King, health injustice anywhere is a threat to health everywhere. I'd like to close this evening by framing that cautionary point more positively. Health justice is good for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. That was really terrific. Your book is so rich and so filled with thought-provoking stories and research. I really appreciate you sharing a bit of it with us tonight.
Thanks.
In particular, I think your truth-telling as women with some privilege, it is an important obligation, I think, that we have to name things out loud, like the tailwinds or the headwinds. Is that what you called it?
The headwinds, that's right.
Yeah, the built-in headwinds. Saying it out loud and validating what people of color, disabled people have been saying for a long time about the routine disregard for their health and well-being, and to the levels of brutality, really, in our health system. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
With the book and in your remarks tonight, you really speak a great deal, starting with your opening story about Michael Hickson, about implicit bias, and how implicit bias on the part of physicians and other healthcare professionals continues to exist in a regular, almost everyday way in our community. You gave examples about the persistent myth that people with disabilities have a lower quality of life. People of color don't feel pain in the same way. And you go on to really trace the connections between health disparities that result in really disparate treatment. Can you talk a little bit more about the connections between implicit bias and health impacts?
Yeah, so I think that it plays a really important role, in large part because, I think by and large the vast majority of medical professionals want to do the right thing, believe they are doing the right thing. And the challenge with implicit bias is that in many instances, they may not be aware that they hold them. And I think that there are tools that exist now for identifying implicit bias in yourself, learning whether you harbor them, and then being able to figure out what you might do in response. And I think that's an important step that needs to occur in medical education and in medical practice. But I also, I don't want to let medicine off the hook too easily, because in addition to those kind of implicit biases, there are also a lot of stereotypes that are, I think, more consciously perpetuated without thinking about their impact. You mentioned, for example, the myth or stereotype that Black people feel pain less keenly. And it's remarkable to me that in research that was published within the past 10 years, a substantial minority of medical students and residents at a prestigious medical school reported believing that myth. And so there's really, I think, a great deal of importance to make sure that those kinds of myths and stereotypes are really rooted out of medical practice, and that there's an attempt on the part of physicians to look for them, because we know they exist. It's the kind of thing that exists kind of right under our nose.
But we have to want to see them.
We have to want to see them.
Yeah. And there's nothing like being in deep, authentic, and ongoing relationships with people who are different from us to help us take a look at that.
That's very true. It's also very true that you and I were talking about this some before, that representation matters, right? So people, black people and disabled people are enormously underrepresented in the medical profession. And so that means that when they sit down with someone who they don't immediately feel kind of a kinship towards, it makes it all the easier for myths or stereotypes or implicit bias to take hold. And so I think it's really important that we be paying more attention to increasing the number of black people and other people of color and disabled people in the medical field.
Absolutely. You also talked some early in your talk about Marion Sims and about the roots of modern gynecology, the brutal roots, and made me think that this past weekend was the 50th anniversary of Roe v. Wade, and that we as a country are still really having deeply fraught conversations about reproductive rights. So in Embodied Injustice, you talk some about the country's history of racism and ableism that is interconnected with reproductive rights. And so I know we have only a few minutes, and it's a massive conversation and topic, but can you talk a little bit about what health justice looks like relative to reproductive health?
Yeah, so in the book, I have a chapter that focuses on reproductive rights, but that really focuses not on abortion rights as much as on the history that black women and disabled women have faced of having the state or the medical profession impose restrictions on their ability to procreate, their ability to have children, right? So, you know, probably the example that most people would be familiar with is the history of eugenic sterilizations, but of disabled women, but certainly black women have faced many constraints on their reproduction. And underneath both of those groups' experiences, this belief that, you know, these women don't make good mothers, right? This unfounded stereotype or myth. And so it's actually, I think, important for, you know, for me and for you as white women to recognize that the traditional kind of reproductive rights movement, with its focus on abortion rights, really has faced some critique by women of color saying, yeah, that's important, but it's really also important that we be able to have children when we want, and that we be permitted to parent and raise our children when we have them. And that critique led to the development of what's called the reproductive justice movement, which kind of stands in some contrast to the reproductive rights movement, which was primarily led by white women. The reproductive justice movement has been primarily developed by women of color. But abortion rights are really important to those women as well, to all women. And I think this isn't something I address in my book, because I guess when I was writing the book, I still lived in this belief that they couldn't overturn Roe versus Wade. But some of the studies that have come out, you know, in the time period since it became imminent and then has happened, have looked at how the rates of maternal mortality differ in states that restrict or ban abortions and states that permit women to seek abortions as health care. And in states that restrict or ban abortions, women are about 3 times more likely to die as a result of getting pregnant or giving birth or in the period shortly thereafter. And it's important from a racial justice perspective because black women are about 2.5 times more likely than white women in any kind of setting to die as a result of getting pregnant or having a child, right? So the rate of mortality in states that restrict access to abortion is really likely to be devastating, and especially so for women of color. So I think this is, you know, perhaps were I writing the book today, I might, add that back in. But I think it's really important to recognize the multiple dimensions of rights that are necessary for there to be true reproductive justice.
Yeah, thank you. So in your book, you zoom in and you zoom out on health and injustice, on racism and ableism. You talk very specifically about physicians, about the healthcare system, and then in other chapters you talk about housing and transportation and education access and criminal justice system and institutionalization. So what do these issues have to do with health?
Well, so these are the areas, the sectors you just listed are what public health people, sociologists refer to as the social determinants of health, right? And I mentioned this a little bit in my talk, but it's widely recognized that actually those social determinants of health have a bigger impact on the health of populations than do access to medical care. And in all of the areas that you listed, whether you think housing or education or employment or transportation or participation in politics, all of those are areas where there are significant racial disparities and disability-based disparities in our country. Many of them are connected to poverty, but poverty in the United States itself is traceable back to histories of slavery and segregation and discrimination and institutionalization that are still having effects today. So I don't know of anybody out there who thinks that we as a society could fix the problem of health disparities just by paying attention to the medical care system or the healthcare system. It's widely acknowledged that probably some of the most important areas to work on lie outside in these areas that involve social determinants of health.
Absolutely. So in your book, you talk about really a deep dive about intersectionality of race and disability. You call out the ways that injustice lives at all levels, in the individual, in healthcare offices, in systems, in insurance payment and reimbursement, in health policy, in the broader general public. What is it that you hope will happen as a result of spending the last several years of your life deeply immersed in writing this book?
There are a number of things that I hope will happen. I hope that some people will read the book. And really what I hope they'll do with it kind of depends on who it is, right? So for a general reader, I hope that reading the book will make them realize kind of some of the injustices that exist in our society that they may not have been aware of before, and to see how there's the connection to race and disability, and perhaps even to feel moved to feel like they have some responsibility to pay attention and do something when they can. For people who are in the medical profession or the healthcare industry, I think there's a heavier responsibility to really start paying close attention, to be willing to have the humility to say that, wow, historically we've really done some bad stuff, and even today we're doing things that produce results that we shouldn't be proud of. And so we need to look in the mirror, right? It's one of those doctor, heal thyself kind of moments. We need to look in the mirror and figure out how we can change how we fundamentally provide care. And so I hope that increasing awareness and prompting some action there. For researchers, I hope that there's a lot more research to find out about the experiences of people who are both Black and disabled, because there's a real lack of knowledge there. And then for the last thing, it would be for people who are already active in this area, who are advocates or activists in areas relating to racial justice or disability justice. I hope that the book will encourage them to see someone in the other movement as, wow, you actually could be a really good ally for me. It may not be an easy conversation. There are a lot of historical reasons why there've not been close alliances between racial justice advocates and disability justice advocates, but I think they have a lot of common ground and could really create some momentum and power by working together. So that's my idea of helping to build some foundation for those partnerships.
Absolutely. I think that's a really hopeful place to end, is with our opportunity to listen better, understand more, be on the lookout, make changes, build coalitions in this kind of way. As you say, health justice is better for everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mary, for this evening, for sharing your remarks and your scholarship and your book, all of these really powerful stories. Thanks to Pittsburgh Arts and Lectures, and thanks to all of you. Can we have a good round of applause to our speaker tonight? Thank you all, and I hope that you read the book, buy the book, have your books autographed if you'd like. Mary will be personalizing at the front of the stage, and please talk about what you heard tonight and share what you've learned. We have an obligation to interrogate the things that we've been silent about and the stories we haven't told, and you can be part of making that change. So thanks to all of you. Have a great night.